sort of say that this is where we started, well, where I started, I suppose, when I wrote the grant proposal in England. My interest in this, because I was noticing a lot of activities which felt like they were taking place somewhere in the middle of that spectrum. And you can hear a lot of people here today are interested in sharing and collaboration and how that can kind of retool the economy. But it's a sort of, in some ways, this end of the spectrum has not fallen out of our project, but it could fall out of the project. And I think it's a really interesting question to keep it in there. So if you take transport, for example, and I was really hoping Bruce might be here by then, but we can give our views on what car sharing in Sydney fits in here and bounce them off from where it comes. But if you, right on the one end of the spectrum, you might have actual direct action, road rendering protests. And that's a form of activism which has been around for a long time, and it's the meaning that I guess I gave to activism when I thought about climate change activism and writing a grant proposal around that. But I think and then I guess the other, perhaps, moving slightly away from that end of the spectrum, you get something that's more professionalized and set up through a specific entity, NGO lobbying for public transport or other non-car-centric road planning. And those are both much more focused on, on government in this case, or in this case either on government or the system as a whole, if you like. And the title of the workshop today sort of implicitly has underneath it a question about to what extent is the activist end of the spectrum about a dissatisfaction with the system or capitalism or whatever label, the larger political economy or the over-dominance of the profit motive. There are a number of ways you could describe that, but we titled the workshop Challenges for Business as Usual. And Declan pointed out a few days ago that at one point it was actually challenges to business as usual. And somewhere along the line it morphed. And I think that's quite interesting in itself, because when you get to this side part of the spectrum, you're now developing positive organizations aimed at replacing a particular way of running the economy, if you like, rather than kind of lobbying to change the parameters of the economy or protesting directly against it. And in here, you have a kind of spectrum of activities, which is maybe more where a lot of people are working here, is what does it do to share and collaborate to a great extent to the overall economy. And within that zone, you can end up on a sort of evolutionary path, if you like, towards something that looks much more familiar with multinational car rental company and corporate social responsibility. And part of what we're interested in is the multiple kind of dimensions along what's happening in this spectrum, what's different about these kinds of enterprises. It might be that they have a different, we think three things in particular are happening here that are innovative compared to the standard economy. One is the organizational ownership and control rules. So Janelle will say more about this when she's talking, but some of the kind of community relationships that happen in peer-to-peer car sharing, to what extent are they actually built into the entity structure of the organization that runs that? But obviously there might be also social impacts in a more external way. What's the actual impact on climate change outcomes or carbon footprints, for example? And to what degree those kinds of environmental or social impacts actually interact with the for-profit structure is something that becomes a really nut question in the area of social enterprise. And we actually left on the spectrum the question marks there deliberately, because it was meant to provoke the question of, is either of these a social enterprise, or both of them a social enterprise? Or would a social enterprise in the area of car sharing actually look like something different? Is there another vision of that? And, we're certainly not proposing there's one right answer, but I think what we'll discuss today will help to elaborate some of the lines on which that goes. So I think community ownership and control and the relationship to the state are all different areas in the middle of that spectrum which will come up time and again. So now Declan's going to say something about the next slide.
Yeah, so this is really kind of thinking around this question of how we might conceptualize these trajectories across the spectrum, and it's really kind of flagging some of the findings that we've found early on. Kind of just drawing on the Weberian ideal type here to group these. So they're not empirical descriptions, but they're findings that we've found across different sectors. So this is kind of speaks to this question of whether there's just something happening in all these different sectors we're looking at individually, or whether we can start to conceptualise something bigger that's happening called a sharing economy. And if so, who's it actually inhabited by? So we found corporate refugees is a term that we've borrowed from one of our food activists. And they've come from large businesses, and it's, I think, kind of Marxist concepts of alienation are very useful here, because they've just found the structure of their organisations and the culture of their organisations oppressive. We've also had quite a few people come from different levels of government, tired of the pace of it often, and it's also been people who've been seeking to solve climate change through government, and then once a change of government's come in, who have tried to backpedal on that, they've said, all right, we're going to go and pursue this elsewhere. So there's really a calling there. There's a kind of vocational thing about solving a bigger problem. There's a question of millennial idealists. I don't know whether anyone would identify with that label, but I've certainly come across a lot of those people in my time in climate activism. And then this question of charisma is one that comes up over and over again. Often setting up support organisations takes someone charismatic who just doesn't have the personality to deal with specifics, and it's this trade-off between charisma and kind of managerialism, where the enterprise will follow through their charisma, and then it'll be taken over by a board, and the board will start instituting procedures, and they'll kind of look back on it, and there's some very interesting dynamics there. And then there's this question of technology that comes up in all sorts of interesting ways, but most prominently in energy around the kind of socio-techniques of this. So we've come. That looks quite static, those types, but we just wanted to say we've come at that through these. We've done about 50 interviews with people from different enterprises, and it's about also trying to figure out what's the actual time. There's a time dimension to this, that people move along a path, and in some ways the spectrum from activism to enterprise, or backwards, back and forwards, is a biographical one. We've actually used LinkedIn biographies to study, the ways in which people move from one area to another, and that's given us an angle on different ways that people negotiate the tensions between activism and enterprise. And I'll only say something about the evolutionary example here. This is. But we've got some other examples in the primer we distributed about people who see them more in terms of oppositional, opposite types of activities, and other ones who have an interesting way of moving between them dialectically. But, I mean, in both these instances are just examples of an evolutionary type of trajectory where a particular personal event in the person's life catalyzes their involvement in cause-based organizations or some form of campaign where they weren't doing that before. And so catalysis, in a sense, is speeding up a reaction between substances through the catalyst. So we've had examples of someone who's working for a farm that gets rationalised or actually goes bust as a result of the decisions of a corporate board responding to market pressures, or maybe somebody is working in a particular environment and sees a TED talk that pulls together a number of strands about their frustrations with that environment in a way that pitches them forward into working into that space. And then obviously their existing skills and expertise get brought to bear on what they then do and how they're going to structure the organisations and projects they build in ways that play out in the tensions between activism and enterprise that I mentioned earlier. So we're trying to almost think of it like a habitat, like an ecology that's developing. What are the inhabitants of that ecology? And that brings us to our last. Yeah, this has been one of the most fun parts of the research, actually, is the menagerie we've been building. Very early on we met with an organisational studies professor who suggested that it's an interesting exercise to ask people what animal they think their organisation is. And it's been interesting in a few ways. They'd often just say an animal offhand and then go, oh no, actually it's this animal. So I've gone with the first animal that's popped in their head here. And it might seem like a fairly silly exercise, but there's actually some really interesting, serious work on the relationship between concepts from the natural environment and the way it moves into highly rational kind of social scientific domains, particularly economics. And I'm thinking of Phil Borowski's work on the interplay between concepts of economic growth and the physical and biological sciences. So it's been a fun and very useful and practical exercise for us, and I've just got a list here of all of the animals that people identify with. Yeah, it's everything from dodos through to tortoises and sheep and packs of wolves. And one of my favourite is malaria. Yeah, this was trying to destroy a particular existing business model in parasitic being a parasite. So yeah, we'd like to open it up for